The town is named after a woman who wasn't supposed to be there. Sedona Arabella Miller was born in 1877 in Gorin, Missouri, a small town where her father claimed to be the second richest man around. She attended the Gorin Academy, learned piano, became a teacher. And then she married T.C. Schneble, a Presbyterian in a Methodist town, and her parents wrote her out of their will. So in 1901, T.C.'s brother Ellsworth, who had gone to the Arizona Territory for his health, convinced the newlyweds to come west. They arrived at a settlement of maybe 15 families strung along a creek in a red-walled canyon, and T.C. built a 2-story house that doubled as a hotel, a general store, and eventually a post office. When Washington asked for a name, T.C. suggested Oak Creek Crossing and Schneble Station. Both rejected. Too long for the postmark stamp. Ellsworth said, "Try Sedona. One word, easy to fit." On June 26, 1902, the Postmaster General approved it. That's how a woman's first name, her mother Amanda always claimed she'd made it up, became the name of one of the most visited places in Arizona. 3 million people a year now come to see it. The median home price has crossed $1 million, and nearly 1 in 5 houses sits empty between guests, converted to vacation rentals that the city has been largely powerless to regulate. The name that was a last resort is now a brand worth $1 billion a year. The woman it belonged to died in 1950 and is buried in a small cemetery off a dirt road. But Sedona's story isn't about a woman or a name. It's about red rock. 270-million-year-old Permian sandstone, stained rust by iron oxide, carved by Oak Creek into buttes and spires and mesas that look, depending on your disposition, like cathedrals or like the backdrop for a gunfight. And the story of Sedona is the story of what happens when a landscape is so extraordinary that everyone who finds it decides it must mean something. Cowboys, surrealists, psychics, developers, influencers, they all looked at the same rocks and saw completely different things. And every time a new group arrived with a new vision, they erased the one before it. What's left, after a century of projection, is a place that 3 million people visit and almost nobody can describe. They come for the vortexes, or the views, or the shopping, or the Jeep tours. They sit in traffic on Highway 89A. They take a photograph that looks exactly like 20 million other photographs. And some of them leave thinking they've been to Sedona, when what they've actually been to is the latest version of a story the rocks never asked to tell. For the first 4 decades after T.C. Schneble's post office opened, Sedona was a farming community and not much else. The families along Oak Creek grew apples and peaches, good ones by all accounts, sold up in Flagstaff and over in Jerome, the copper mining boom town perched on Mingus Mountain. Getting anything in or out was an ordeal. In 1902, T.C. and Ellsworth Schneble wanted to build a road up out of the canyon, the road that today bears the Schneble name and remains one of the most hair-raising drives in Arizona, a jarring switchback track up the face of the Mogollon Rim that in places feels more like a suggestion than a road. There was no paved road in or out of Sedona for decades, no electricity until the 1950s. Parts of the surrounding area didn't get power until the 1960s. The first telephone directory, mid-1950s, had 155 listings. By Max Ernst's count, when he first visited in 1943, 16 people lived in the town proper. The red rocks were simply the walls of the place where you lived. Spectacular walls, certainly, but walls nonetheless. Nobody drove 120 miles from Phoenix to look at them because nobody could. Arizona's old economy ran on what they called the 3 C's: cattle, copper, and cotton. Sedona had a little of the first, none of the others, and no railroad to carry any of it. What changed Sedona first was a novelist. Zane Grey came to Oak Creek Canyon in 1918 to hunt and fish, and the landscape got under his skin the way it would get under so many others. He wrote The Call of the Canyon about it, A story set among looming stone walls and whispering pines, a place where a man wounded by the modern world could heal. It was a fantasy of escape, and it sold enormously well. In 1923, Grey came back with a film crew to shoot a silent movie version. He had unusual clout for a writer. He insisted on filming where the stories were set, not on a back lot in Hollywood. Only 29 seconds of that silent film survive, found decades later. But those 29 seconds, a brief stagecoach ride along the switchbacks of Oak Creek Canyon, were the first frames of a very long reel. By the early 1940s, Hollywood had noticed what Grey had noticed. The red rocks looked like the American frontier was supposed to look, and they were cheaper and closer than Monument Valley. The town had no mining, no railroad, no industry of any kind. When the film crews arrived, they were the industry. In 1944, John Wayne came to Sedona to shoot Tall in the Saddle, and he liked it enough that when he decided to produce his own picture for the first time, Angel and the Bad Man, in 1945, he brought the whole production back. A local man named Oscar Giles saw the opportunity and replaced the old Civilian Conservation Corps buildings with the Sedona Lodge, a facility designed to house 300 people and 2 film crews simultaneously. Republic Pictures built a soundstage next door, just in case of rain. And in Grasshopper Flat, beneath the formation called Coffee Pot Rock, the studio constructed a western town. False front saloons, a telegraph office, a general store, a hitching post, the whole mythology of the frontier built out of lumber and paint against a wall of red sandstone that was 200 million years older than the idea of America. That movie set at Coffee Pot Rock became one of the most used locations in Hollywood. Between 1945 and 1950, 19 movies were filmed in Sedona. Nearly 4 a year. Cesar Romero, Tyrone Power, Joan Crawford, Henry Fonda, Glenn Ford, Robert Young, Sterling Hayden. They all stood in front of those rocks and pretended to be someone taming the West. Joan Crawford filmed Johnny Guitar there in 1954, a Nicholas Ray picture so psychologically intense that the French New Wave critics later claimed it as a masterpiece. The red rocks behind Crawford's saloon were the same ones behind Wayne's Quaker homestead, the same ones behind a dozen B westerns whose titles nobody remembers. For the 400 to 800 residents of the area, the movie business was the economy. Locals worked as extras, built sets, ran catering, provided security. A rancher could make more money in a week of filming than in a month of selling peaches. The town had found its purpose, and its purpose was to be a backdrop. Having no mining, no railroad, and no industry of any kind, the money from Hollywood, as one historical account put it, became critical to residents. But there's a paradox in being a backdrop. The better you do it, the faster you ruin it. Throughout the 1950s, people who'd seen Sedona on the screen started coming to see it in person. Retirees mostly, drawn by the mild climate at 4,300 feet. Warm winters, cool summers, none of Flagstaff's snow, none of Phoenix's broil. After World War II, the discovery of a groundwater aquifer under West Sedona opened the way for new housing developments, and for the first time, people could build homes away from the creek. The population crept upward, new rooftops appeared, and the filmmakers who needed empty horizons for their wide shots began to notice houses at the edges of the frame. So many films had used the same formations that some producers and directors began to worry the scenery was overexposed. Audiences would recognize the rocks from the last picture. 18 movies were filmed in the entirety of the 1950s. Fewer than had been made in 5 peak years of the previous decade. By 1960, the Western genre itself was dying, and Sedona's rooftops were finishing the job. The last significant production was an Elvis Presley vehicle called Stay Away Joe, shot in 1967. a movie so aggressively bad that it feels almost prophetic, as if Hollywood itself were saying goodbye to Sedona by making something not worth watching. The movie set at Coffee Pot Rock, the one John Wayne had built, was torn down. In its place, a developer put up a residential subdivision called Sedona West. The street names are all that's left: Pony Soldier Road, Flaming Arrow Way, Johnny Guitar, Last Wagon Drive. You can drive down a cul-de-sac named after a fake gunfight in a neighborhood where a fake town once stood, and look up at the same real rocks that haven't changed in 250 million years. But while Hollywood was packing up, something stranger was settling in. The first visit happened in the summer of 1943, when Dorothea Tanning needed dry air to recover from a bout of encephalitis. Max Ernst, the German-born painter and sculptor, one of the founders of Dada and then surrealism, a man who had fled the Nazis, been interned in French camps, escaped to New York, married Peggy Guggenheim, then left Guggenheim for Tanning after falling in love with her over a game of chess and a painting called Birthday, brought her to Arizona. In his biographical notes, Ernst mentioned that 16 people lived in Sedona at the time. By 1946, the couple returned for good. They drove across the country, and Ernst looked at the red rock landscape and recognized something. It looked like what he'd been painting all along, the landscapes of hallucination, of dreams that are more vivid than waking life. The surrealists had studied Carl Jung, who had met with a Hopi elder whose ideas about dreaming and the fluid boundary between dream life and waking life had profoundly influenced Jung's thinking. The surrealists saw in the Hopi a mirror of their own philosophy. Ernst said that Paris and Sedona were the only two places in the world where he'd want to live. He and Tanning rented a small studio space in what is today improbably the site of Tlaquepaque shopping village, and then built a house with their own hands in a place so remote they didn't have electricity. They called it Capricorn Hill, and they lived among lizards, scorpions, and snakes. For the next 7 years, some of their most significant work came from that house in the desert. Ernst's cement sculpture Capricorn, completed in 1948, drew on Hopi and Zuni traditions he encountered nearby. Marcel Duchamp visited them in Sedona. Lee Miller photographed Ernst there, dressed in a Hopi Kachina mask. Tanning, who called Arizona a landscape of wild fantasy, painted canvases that now hang in the Tate Modern. Ernst became an American citizen. And then, in the early 1950s, they left for France. The desert years were over. But the idea they'd planted, that Sedona was a place for seekers, for people attuned to something invisible in the landscape, would outlast every painting they'd made there. The surrealists didn't come to Sedona because it was beautiful. They came because it was weird, because the rocks looked like they'd been sculpted by a subconscious mind. But their arrival planted a seed. Other artists followed, drawn by the light, the color, the remoteness, the faint glamour of Ernst's name. By the 1960s, Sedona had a small but real arts community, encouraged in part by a realtor named Mary Lou Keller, who let people hold spiritual gatherings for free in a building she owned. A group called Ruby Focus, later Rainbow Ray Focus, bought property near Airport Mesa, claiming it was a place of particular energy. The language was vague. The real estate transactions were not. Something was beginning to accumulate around those rocks that had nothing to do with movies. Then, in 1956, between the last of the Westerns and the first of the Crystal Shops, something truly remarkable happened. Marguerite Brunswig Staud, sculptor, rancher, student of Frank Lloyd Wright, finished building the Chapel of the Holy Cross. She'd been carrying the idea for 24 years. In 1932, she'd looked at the newly completed Empire State Building in New York and seen a cross in its silhouette. She worked with Lloyd Wright, Frank's son, on designs for a soaring glass cathedral to be built overlooking the Danube in Budapest. The war killed that plan. She tried Southern California. Zoning killed that. Finally, she found a twin-pinnacled spur of red rock jutting out from a 1,000-foot wall in Sedona, and she decided to put her chapel there. Because the spur was on national forest land, she needed a literal act of Congress. Senator Barry Goldwater helped her get the permit. The firm of Anshin and Allen designed it. The construction supervisor, Fred Kukas, built it in 18 months. It cost $300,000, all of it funded by Staud and her family, who had made their fortune in the wholesale pharmaceutical business. The American Institute of Architects gave it an Award of Honor in 1957. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2011. Today, it sits exactly where it was built, a 90-foot reinforced concrete wedge with a cross embedded in its face, rising from the rock as if the rock had always intended to produce it. 250,000 people visit it every year. There is a gift shop adjacent. TripAdvisor reviews mention the long lines and the overpriced trinkets. The experience can feel more commercial than sacred, one visitor wrote, which is one way of describing what has happened to the entire town. The 1970s brought the next reinvention, and it came from a Nevada real estate developer named Abe Miller. Miller loved Mexico, and he loved Sedona, and he had the eye for combining enthusiasms that marks a particular kind of American entrepreneur. On the banks of Oak Creek, he found a property owned by Harry and Ruby Gerard, several acres of flat land shaded by enormous sycamore trees. This, as it happened, was roughly where T.C. and Sedona Schneble had built their original homestead 70 years earlier. Miller spent 2 years persuading the Gerards to sell, and the crucial promise was that the sycamores would not be touched. He then flew planes all over Mexico, photographing and sketching villages, documenting the stucco walls and cobblestone paths and arched entryways and wrought iron balconies, and he built all of it under the sycamores in Sedona. He called it Tlaquepaque, after a city on the outskirts of Guadalajara. The word is Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and it means the best of everything. He hired an architect named Bob McIntyre, and the complex opened in 1973. The branches of the Gerard sycamores twist across the rooftops and peek into rooms. Today, Tlaquepaque has more than 50 galleries and shops, and is one of the most photographed places in Sedona. At the time it was built, the town had one stoplight, and cattle still wandered into people's backyards. Miller's Tlaquepaque was an invention, but it was an invention of taste, an aesthetic transplant that took root because the soil was right. What came next had no precedent in the soil at all. In 1980, a psychic from Florida named Paige Bryant was temporarily living in Sedona when she claimed to have encountered an entity named Albion, who described several specific energy points in the red rock landscape. Bryant named these points vortexes. There was no historical precedent for the term. She was not drawing on any indigenous tradition, though the claim that Native Americans had always known about the energy would become a standard part of the pitch. According to the Sedona Heritage Museum's archives, Bryant started giving workshops and tours centered on the vortexes, and the concept spread through the expanding New Age movement like fire through dry grass. A pair of psychics named Dick Sutphen and Pete Saunders amplified the message. Sutphen built a career out of workshops held at the vortex sites, aimed at developing psychic abilities. The 4 canonical vortexes, Cathedral Rock, Bell Rock, Airport Mesa, and Boynton Canyon, are all within about a mile of a paved road. Bryant was not, as one journalist noted, a wilderness backpacker. But the locations happened to coincide with some of the most dramatic red rock formations in the area, and the iron oxide in the sandstone does produce measurable magnetic field anomalies at some of the sites. Whether that constitutes energy in any meaningful sense depends entirely on what you mean by energy. What is not debatable is what the vortex concept did to Sedona's economy. One of the original vortex sites was on top of Airport Mesa, which led to tourists wandering across the runway of the Sedona airport. The airport owners had to relocate the designated vortex point. The transformation accelerated on August 16, 1987, when Sedona became one of the primary gathering points for the harmonic convergence, a globally synchronized meditation event organized by Jose Arguelles, an art historian who believed that if 144,000 people meditated simultaneously, it would initiate a planetary cleansing cycle correlated with the Mayan calendar. Sedona's population at the time was roughly 7,500. An estimated 10,000 people descended on the town. Most of them gathered at Bell Rock, the smooth, bell-shaped butte along Highway 179. The rumor, and it's unclear where it started, though it was widely reported, was that Bell Rock would open to reveal a spaceship. A couple named Ernst and Anoka had planned their wedding on Bell Rock for that morning. When the spaceship failed to materialize, the crowd joined the wedding party instead. A man sang, and thousands sang along with him. No spaceship emerged. The sun came up, a local later recalled. The creek was still running, the birds were still chirping, and the rocks were still red. What emerged instead was an industry. After the harmonic convergence, people who had come for 2 days started staying for years. Spiritual teachers, energy healers, crystal merchants, aura photographers, channelers, past life regressors, and psychic counselors set up shop along Highway 89A. A free reservation and referral service called Key to Sedona launched in 1990, connecting visitors with affordable lodgings and healers. By 1993, there was an annual directory of Sedona's light workers. A comedy troupe called the Vortex Players had already formed in 1987 to spoof the New Age movement, locals satirizing the very phenomenon that was remaking their town. The jokes didn't slow anything down. Between 1970 and 1990, the permanent population nearly quadrupled, from 2,700 to more than 9,000. In 1988, 1 year after the harmonic convergence, Sedona incorporated as a city for the first time, 86 years after T.C. Schnebley's post office opened. Before incorporation, the area had been governed by 2 counties, Coconino and Yavapai, which Sedona straddles. Now it had a city council, a manager, and the authority to collect sales tax. It also had a new identity. The place that had been a farm, then a movie set, then an artist's colony, was now America's New Age capital, a destination where you could get your aura photographed and your chakras aligned and your crystals charged in the same afternoon, all within sight of the same red rocks that John Wayne had ridden past in black and white. The numbers tell a story that the crystals can't. By 2019, Sedona was receiving an estimated 3 million visitors annually, and tourism was a billion-dollar industry. Visitors generated 77% of the city's sales and bed tax revenues, roughly $31 million in local tax revenue in fiscal year 2023 alone. Only the Grand Canyon draws more people to Arizona. The city has approximately 2,800 hotel rooms. Average annual hotel occupancy ran around 67%. But the hotels are only part of it. In 2016, the Arizona legislature passed a law, sometimes called the Airbnb bill, that prohibited cities and towns from regulating short-term home rentals. Governor Doug Ducey signed it. The law was sold to lawmakers as a way for empty nesters and homeowners to make a little extra money by renting a spare room to a tourist. What it actually did, in a town where 3 million visitors were already arriving each year, was transform residential neighborhoods into de facto hotel districts. Before the 2016 law took effect, Sedona had an estimated 200 to 300 vacation rentals. By 2019, that number had grown to more than 1,000, 20% of Sedona's total housing inventory. A woman named Robin Kelly moved back to Sedona in 2018 and spent months on waiting lists before she found a home to rent. The experience was, she said, a far cry from her first move to Sedona a decade earlier, when it had taken her 2 days to find a furnished home. She eventually rented an unfurnished place for $1,600 a month, $400 more than the same property would have cost 3 years prior. By 2023, a city councilor named Jessica Williams put the short-term rental figure at 17% of all housing, one of the highest densities in the state. The city declared a housing shortage emergency. The median home price pushed past $1 million. Only 4% of Sedona's housing stock is apartments, far below the national average of 20%. And the city's own zoning had made it difficult to build more until recently. Workers in the hospitality industry, the people who actually run the restaurants, clean the hotel rooms, and guide the Jeep tours, couldn't afford to live in the town their labor sustains. A resident named Ann Kelly described driving through neighborhoods speckled with short-term rental properties. "There's no neighbors, there's no activity," she said. "It's all just empty houses waiting for the next group of tourists to come in." They commute from Cottonwood, 19 miles to the southwest, or from Camp Verde, or from the village of Oak Creek. An employee at a crepe restaurant told a reporter that she and all her co-workers drive in from Cottonwood. "It would mean a lot," she said, talking about what it would be like to live closer. "Gas is super expensive now." The city's housing manager, Shannon Boone, put it more starkly. "Our employers tell us regularly, we have a couple employees living in their cars. What are you doing about housing?" In 2022, the city allocated $240,000 for something called the Rent Local program, essentially paying homeowners between $3,000 and $10,000 to convert their Airbnb properties into long-term rentals for local workers. It was a remarkable admission. The city was bribing its own residents to house the workforce that kept the tourism economy running. Multiple attempts to pass state legislation capping short-term rentals in communities like Sedona have failed, blocked by the real estate industry and Airbnb's lobbyists. The 3-year lobbying moratorium that accompanied a 2022 compromise bill has done little to change the underlying math. A homeowner in Sedona can charge a tourist $300 a night for a house that would rent to a local worker for $1,600 a month. The math is not complicated. The consequences are. Meanwhile, the town itself has become something its various discoverers might not recognize. Uptown Sedona, the stretch of 89A that serves as the commercial center, is 3 blocks of gift shops, crystal stores, timeshare sales booths, fudge shops, and Jeep tour outfitters, all framed by the same red rocks that made Zane Grey reach for his typewriter. One shop advertises aura photographs. Another sells crystals the size of footballs. A third offers psychic readings. Between them, someone is hawking timeshare seminars in exchange for cheap Jeep tours. The First National Bank of Arizona, where Elvis stood in 1967 at the corner of Forest Road and 89A, is now a T-shirt and gift shop. Locals describe Uptown as a headache. Lots of jaywalkers, traffic, parking is always a challenge. Lots of tacky souvenir shops, wrote one resident. Another, who'd been visiting since the 1970s, announced flatly, "I do not plan to return." The Pink Jeep Tours, Sedona's most visible commercial tour operation, run continuously, their bubblegum-colored vehicles bouncing up the same roads where film crews once shot in relative solitude. Helicopter tours flew over neighborhoods and resorts until 2020, when operators agreed to a fly-friendly policy, limiting overflights within city limits. The town that had no paved roads until the 1950s now has traffic problems that generate the kind of civic rage usually reserved for much larger places. Sedona is accessed by exactly 2 state highways, 179 from the south and 89A from east and west. And on a spring weekend, a drive that should take 20 minutes can take an hour. Residents adjust their schedules to avoid peak hours. A website called Sedona.biz published an analysis arguing that the traffic crisis wasn't inevitable, it was chosen, noting that the city repeatedly rejects large-scale regional solutions in favor of incremental tweaks. A roundabout here, a crosswalk there, a shuttle that runs during peak season. There is a paradox in all of this, that the rocks themselves seem to understand better than the people arguing about parking. Sedona has not declined. It has not been abandoned. It has not suffered the fate of so many American towns hollowed out by a vanished industry. Its industry, beauty, is literally set in stone. The rocks will not close. The light will not relocate to a cheaper state. The problem is the opposite of what usually kills a place. Not too little demand, but too much. Not neglect, but a kind of consuming adoration that has turned the town into a mirror of every American impulse it once seemed to offer escape from. Zane Grey wrote about a man who went to Oak Creek Canyon to escape the noise and falseness of modern life. 100 years later, the noise and falseness have followed him there, wearing hiking boots and carrying selfie sticks. The commercialism, the traffic, the unaffordability, the displacement of workers, the conversion of homes into revenue units, the reduction of a landscape to a backdrop for content. These are not Sedona's problems. They are America's problems, concentrated into 19 square miles of very red real estate. Only 51% of the land within city limits is privately owned. The rest belongs to the Coconino National Forest. So the math is stark. All of Sedona's growth, all of its hotels and shops and subdivisions and vacation rentals is squeezed onto roughly 9.5 square miles of buildable ground, walled in on every side by federal land that will never be developed. There is nowhere left to build and nowhere left to expand, and the visitors keep coming anyway. Consider what's happened to each layer of Sedona's identity. The farms are gone. The orchards that once shipped peaches to Flagstaff and Jerome exist only in historical society archives. The movie set is a subdivision. Max Ernst's house at Capricorn Hill is owned by an art historian who curates exhibits about the surrealists who once lived there, which is lovely, but is also the definition of a place that has become a museum of itself. The Chapel of the Holy Cross draws 250,000 visitors a year who experience it primarily as a line and a gift shop. Tlaquepaque, Abe Miller's transplanted Mexican village, has more than 50 galleries and shops and hosts events and festivals and art walks, and it is beautiful, genuinely beautiful. But it is also a shopping center, which is what Miller built it to be, and which is exactly what it has become. The vortexes are trailheads with parking problems. The New Age economy that seemed so countercultural in 1987 has become as mainstream and as monetized as any other tourist attraction. You can get an aura photograph for $40. You can buy a crystal the size of a football for considerably more. The distinction between spiritual experience and retail transaction has been worn as smooth as river rock. And the visitors keep coming. In 2025, TripAdvisor ranked Sedona the 12th most popular destination in the United States, up 4 spots from the previous year. The Enchantment Resort, home to the luxury wellness spa Mi Amo, was named the #1 hotel in Arizona by U.S. News and World Report. The median recorded sale price for a single-family home in Sedona proper hit $1,232,500 in 2024, with an average price of $552 per square foot, up 7% from the year before. Real estate agents anticipate another wave of buyers from California, displaced by wildfires, looking for a new frontier. That word again, frontier. It keeps coming back. The population, though, has been slowly declining. The 2000 census counted 10,192 residents. By 2010, it was 10,020. The 2020 census put it at 9,684. The 2023 estimate was 9,784. The city is getting more expensive and more visited, and slightly less inhabited all at the same time. Workers leave because they can't afford to stay. Retirees sell because their homes are worth more as vacation rentals than as places to live. The community thins even as the crowds thicken. At what point, the city manager once wondered aloud, are the community's residents so outnumbered that there's no real community left? It's worth remembering that the name itself was an accident. T.C. Schneble wanted to call the place Oak Creek Crossing, a name that described what it was, a place where you crossed a creek among oak trees. The post office said no. He wanted Schneble Station, which would have described who had built it. The post office said no again. What they accepted was a woman's first name, a name her mother had invented, a name that described nothing about the place at all. And maybe that's the truest thing about Sedona, that its name was always empty enough to be filled with whatever meaning the next arrival wanted to pour into it. A frontier, a canvas, a portal, a brand. The rocks don't care. They were here before anyone named anything. Sedona Schneble spent her last years saving money to build a chapel. Not the famous one, not the one Marguerite Staud wedged into the rock face with Barry Goldwater's help and $300,000. A small one, the Wayside Chapel, a non-denominational gathering place off Highway 89A, was funded in part by Sedona's own savings and dedicated in her honor shortly before she died on November 13, 1950. She was 73. She is buried at Cook's Cedar Glade Cemetery in the town that bears her name. Her grave does not appear on any list of Sedona's top 10 attractions. There is no line. There is no gift shop. Down in what used to be Grasshopper Flat, where John Wayne's Western Town once stood, the streets of the Sedona West subdivision curve past ranch-style houses with red rock views. Pony Soldier Road runs into Flaming Arrow Way. Last Wagon Drive dead ends. The telegraph office from Angel and the Badman, the original building moved to Sedona from a railroad depot in Winona, was saved by the Sedona Historical Society and sits at 735 Jordan Road. Some of the original props from the scene where Wayne's wounded gunman collapses at the telegraph counter are still inside, sitting on the desk. The rest of the set is gone. The rocks behind it look exactly the same as they did in 1945, which is exactly the same as they looked in 1902, which is exactly the same as they looked 10,000 years before anyone was there to look at them at all. The light hits them around 5 in the afternoon, and they go from rust to copper to something close to blood. And then the sun drops behind the Mingus Mountains, and they turn purple, and then gray, and then they're just shapes in the dark. And whatever you thought they meant, whatever frontier, whatever energy, whatever revelation you projected onto that ancient stone, goes dark with them.